The strength of a person's spirit would then be measured by how much truth he could tolerate, or more precisely, to what extent he needs to have it diluted, disguised, sweetened, muted, falsified.
This is really important for our culture, to understand where Christianity came from. And this is direct evidence. You can actually walk this path and come to this conclusion. You can know that Christianity was an invention of the Romans. It was done to pacify their subjects. And this is important because it gives us a different way of understanding government, how government operates, the tools that government uses, the purpose that government has for the various propaganda apparatus. Evangelical Christians are getting away with debunking facts as mere theories, even subjects like evolution, but they provide no evidence for their position other than to simply cite religious dogma. And if you look at the influence that dogma is having in the media today, you can easily see it is increasing. I would like to challenge these extremists to consider the possibility that my findings are correct. Though there is much good in Christianity, we have to understand how rulers have used it to control us and how they are still using it to control us today. I hope citizens will be more skeptical when they hear an authority figure using faith to interpret laws, or a belief in Armageddon to create governmental policies. The Flavians encoded a secret message into the Gospels, which we can now understand in a new light. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free.
Religion, the Abrahamic faith, and this relationship to how we see the world and how we react with it now. And one thing I want to say is, off the rip, I threw the quote in the beginning of the video, and I send in respect to Nietzsche. I respect his mind. I respect his sense of fear of repeating the same cycle, even though we know it to be false. And he wanted to go beyond the idea of, God. You read his books, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, or Beyond Good and Evil, or The Genealogy of Morals. He talks about, you see a common concept, something like the Ubermensch come up, going something, the higher ideal of evolution, of what the next special human being will be, and their mind, their manner of being, and their ideas, and how they had to get away from the crowd and the herd and the superficial bullshit and isolate themselves so they can, deeply engage various concepts and just their interaction with reality and loving it and facing it. He respected the Stoics' ideas. Marcus Aurelius' ideas like amor fati, or memento mori, remembering death and love of faith. Whatever your destiny was, to fully embrace it and dive deep into those depths. And it's something I truly respect. And reading Nietzsche, it can take you, two ways depending on how your life is going, man. He can be very inspirational and very dangerous at the same time, but absolutely astounding reader. And reading his books, is nobody who writes like him. No one who can, cultivate my attention and channel my inner phoenix inside. And really appreciate him for that. But let's jump into a bit of this conversation, talking about the Abrahamic faith and Christianity. And this is going to go a lot of different places. I have some clips here of Joseph Atwill's book.
Fully in depth on this subject, because there's a whole lot of illusions about Africa's relationship with other people in the world. There's a whole lot of illusion about our relationship to the religions in the world. And these belief systems that had its origin in Africa, all of them, and there is no exception, turned on African people. I said there is no exception. And there's one thing you have to get through your mind and keep it. Nothing that ever came from the European mind was meant to do anything but facilitate European domination of the world. And I said there's no exception. Everything that was brought into this continent, everything, every idea, every so-called religion was meant to dominate and to control. The Arabs had no illusions about it. The Europeans had no illusions about it. You were the ones with the illusions. And yet every element that went into the making of every major religion in the world started in Africa. Why is it that you are so naive? You let people redress something that you invented, sell it back to you, and enslave you through it.
Child, she was originally white, but there was a storm in the 16th century, passed by and turned it black. But the same storm must have gone to Spain, and then it went to Ethiopia, and it went to the Soviet Union and turned all the black Madonnas black. It was a hell of a storm.
Well, okay, let's get together here. I mean, we're jumping around, and I think we're going to have a beautiful, interesting hour, okay? Because of this subject, I was going to get to this later, but since you opened it, let's deal with it, okay? You're in the Bible Belt, gentlemen.
I heard so.
You heard so. And I must tell our audience, we had dinner together earlier, and we got into this a little bit. So you're going to hear some interesting things. Because you guys are taking issue with a lot of what we grew up with in the Bible as fact. And you're telling me that's not so. You got to picture that.
I brought it right here.
What is it?
Before I show you the picture you wanted to see.
Right.
This is Pope Pius XII. In his private chapel, praying to the Black Madonna and Child and all the popes of Rome. In their private, this from the church. The Roman Catholic Church itself. I just got rid of the copy of the history of the Black Madonna last night. I brought one copy. It's published by the Roman Catholic order of nuns called the Daughters of St. Paul. And they said that the picture of the Black Madonna and Child in Poland is reputed to have been painted by St. Luke. Now, St. Luke is said to have been one of Jesus' disciples. He ought to know what Jesus had looked like. So if he painted a black woman and child, who am I to say that he wasn't? Besides that, however, in Anacalypsis...
So now you guys are saying Jesus was black?
We're not saying it. It's what has been written
that's history.
Up until the Nicene Conference of Bishops in 325, when Rome, under the order of Constantine, the Roman emperor, ordered the 219 bishop at Nicaea, and they took away Christianity from the Africans. Just remember that before they said Jesus was born in a manger in Bethlehem, they said he was born in a cave in Ethiopia. It was at the Nicene Conference that changed that. Let's go further.
Wait a minute, let me be sure I'm following you now. You're saying that the birth of Christ as we know it is not accurate.
It's a farce. It was only...
You realize what you're saying?
A farce, a lie. You know what a lie is?
A lie is a lie.
The person who wrote that at the Nicene Conference of Bishops in 325 AD, Constantine, the Roman emperor, ordered a conference be held because Rome wanted to take over Christianity from the people who started it. Christianity was started with Pantheus and Boetius in a place called Alexandria in Egypt. And Egypt is in Africa. I saw it up to January the 9th, it was there.
You talked about that a little bit last night in your lecture. There was a lecture last night, Dr. Simmons, here on campus. You talked about the separation of people don't want us to see Egypt as part of Africa. You talked about the historical thing about blacks being in Egypt as well.
Yes, what I did last night...
I don't want to get away from the other point.
I just
saying
that what happened is that I dealt last night the fact that Herodotus, the institutions of higher learning, white institutions, considered the father of history. He himself, when he visited Egypt around 450 BC, almost half a thousand years before Christ, said that the Ethiopians, the Egyptians, the people of cultures, which is part of present-day Turkey, were people of black skin and woolly hair. All right? And so I just want you to understand that the Egyptians we now see are conquerors, just like people who came here and took this land from the Indians, so that they're not indigenous to Africa, those who now rule Egypt. And Egypt is just as much a part of Africa as Birmingham or Alabama is part of the so-called United States.
Let me add this.
Let me just be clear on this. So what you're saying to me now is that the people that we see, Sadat and all those guys, are not true Egyptians?
No.
The fact that
Sadat's mother was a Sudanese, Nasser's mother was a Sudanese, but their fathers were Arab conquerors. The one that was the African was Muhammad Naguib, the first president of Egypt, the one that overthrew Farouk. But 1 year after that, since he was looking for a hookup with the other Nile Valley countries as it used to be in antiquity, he was removed by the Arab conquerors. The Arabs didn't come to Egypt until 640. The first non-African people came to Egypt, otherwise called the Hyksos, in 1675 BC. The Africans there were already in the 13th dynastic period. They had built every pyramid you saw there before. They had done the S-turn in the Nile. They built every one of the major temples that had already been built, including the Grand Lodge of Luxor. The first European to come there did not arrive until the Greeks arrived with Alexander II, the son of Philip of Macedonia.
Look, I'm a college graduate. I never heard all this stuff before.
Because they didn't intend to teach you that. They can't tell you that you're inferior and teach you that you taught Egypt, Europe. The first Europeans to be civilized by the Africans were the Greeks. When you heard of Homer, the first European to have written anything, you couldn't miss that. They said that Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. And that was not until 833 BC. The Africans had already in 255,000 at the Tassili Mountain. They had the Sibyllian period, first, second, and third, the pre-dynastic period, all the way up. The Africans had produced men like this, Imhotep, the multi-genius that designed the step pyramid of Saqqara. The first man to be a physician that even Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, is giving him credit and call him the god of medicine. The Greeks changed his name from Imhotep to Aesculapius. There he is. There he is.
Wait a minute. This gets into what you were saying. So wait a minute. You guys are telling me now that black men taught Homer and...
As a matter of fact,
went to Egypt to school.
As a matter of fact, the Egyptians said Homer was Egyptian, not Greek.
That's right. It's only the Europeans said that. The Westerners now said that he was. But let us go back. Remember that Homer himself said in the Odyssey what? That the gods Zeus and Apollo, Europe's first gods, came from Ethiopia. Go read it. And I didn't write it. He wrote it. Thales, from Thales down to Socrates. And Socrates down to Aristotle, which they call the pre-Socratian philosophers and the post-Socratian philosophers. Each and every one, including Plato, who spent 15 years in Egypt receiving their education.
You're saying Plato was educated in Egypt?
15 years. Before that, you heard nothing of him. Every one of them.
What you'd have me believe then also, for part of what you said last night, is that Plato and these guys went back home, and they were big guys. But they were taught in Egypt? Is that what you said?
They came there for their education. And they said it. They didn't hide it. It's the modern writers, the modern instructors and professors who trying to deny it.
Right, you can't have in a racist school in Birmingham non-racist education.
Let me get to something you said last night that's not going to make you very popular in this town and may not allow you to get safely out of town. You told an audience last night that you saw, I think, in a tomb in Egypt.
Yeah.
You saw it with your own two eyes, right?
Yes.
You told me that Moses, there were more than 10 commandments. Moses just took
42. The negative confessions. Moses isn't supposed to have been born until 1349 BC. The Africans were already in the 18th dynastic period. Akhenaten, who died before Moses was born, and Imhotep, who died more than 2,000 years before the birth of Moses, and others at the Grand Lodge of Mem had 42 laws called now the negative confession, one for each nome. They go like this: I have not killed man nor woman. I have not spoken ill of the gods. Moses is supposed to be born in Egypt, they said, at a place called Sukkot. Already, it says that Moses get the 10 commandments of Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is still in Africa, right? The Sinai Peninsula is a part of Egypt. More so, is it possible for Moses to be born in Egypt, educated in Egypt? At age 85, he's still in Egypt, and he did not learn the negative confessions? Is it possible for you to go to school, born in the United States, go to kindergarten, elementary, junior high school, and college, and never heard of the United States Constitution? Then it would have been impossible for Moses, when everybody had to read the negative confession 5 times a day, for Moses not to have seen those 42 laws and extracted 10 of them, leave 32 more. Now, if you could go to the temple of Setaiwan at Abydos, to go to the tomb of Ramesses VI at the Valley of the Kings, go to the temple of Edfu, where you would, by the way, see the story of an immaculate conception and a virgin birth 4,100 years before the Mary and Jesus story.
As a matter of fact,
wait.
No,
let me understand.
This is shocking.
Let me just put it in form of a question then. I mean, I don't want to stop this because we're here for information. But what you're trying to get me to believe is that Moses didn't get the Ten Commandments from Mount Sinai, but he got them
from his fellow Africans.
Moses was the high priest in Egypt, a high priest of the Egyptians in Egypt. Then what was he teaching? He wasn't a high priest of the Jews.
There were no Jews in those days. They called them. Remember now, there was no Israel yet. Israel is not until 1196. And when we to hear of Abraham, Avram as he was called, coming into Egypt, the Africans already in Egypt, already in their 14th dynastic period when he shows up. All of the pyramids are built. That's another thing. Every one, the 62 pyramids in Egypt were built before the first Jew was born.
Why was he fleeing from the Pharaoh?
Let me ask
what
you
was
something.
the charge?
I could write anything when I want to write, you know. Who's going to stop me from writing if I got the power?
I was about to ask you, what kind of trouble do you get into for holding these kind of views?
Oh, the other day a black sister spat in my face, and because she couldn't take that. She couldn't take that Jesus was black. She said, no, no, no. I mean, he had no color. If he didn't have no color, how John the Baptist saw him to baptize him?
Do you realize that you're getting at the foundation, that you're shooting and digging away at the foundation of what most of us grew up believing?
Yeah, well, we believe a lot of things for a long time. One thing, they give us 3 pages in the Bible. Slave, obey your master. And that's what we believed for the longest time. They said that Jesus said, so how would Jesus, who fought the system, say to the slave, obey your master? It didn't sound rational, would it? So, look, most of the things, we're in a European system. You could come to this university and spend 4 years, go back and spend another 2 for your master's, and another 1 or 2 for your doctorate, and never had any course at all about Africans. But every day you come here, you got courses about Europeans. This is an extension of European culture, European belief, European racism. And it has no intent of teaching about the Africans. The Africans built the Europeans' first university, the University of Salamanca in Spain. These are historical records. It's just like...
Okay, one of the things you said last night is that it's not just black people who are saying these things.
No.
Most of this information are written by whites.
In white books.
It's just that they don't emphasize it in the classroom. As a matter of fact, let me back you up when you open up the discourse. We were speaking about Columbus. None of them in here, none of the listening audience, even in the air, has the faintest idea that in the life of Columbus, when after his death, his family had to go to court because charges was raised, and this is in the record in the Vatican, in the secret archives of the Vatican, that Columbus was shown a map of where the Queen of Sheba that Dr. Ben spoke about, this black woman who had mated with Solomon and produced the son, Menelik I, and they lived more than 900 years before the birth of Jesus, had already sailed through what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, came to lands to the west that was longer than Africa and Europe combined. And that, brother, is North, South, and Central America.
May I add this? Right here at this university, they teach, and I've just been here a few days, right? A day. They teach in this institution because it's the same as Cornell anywhere, that Hippocrates was the father of medicine. He's not until 333 BC. Let me read this for you.
Okay, you teach at Cornell, is that?
I teach at Cornell also.
They let you teach this kind of stuff at Cornell?
They teach it now. I'm there.
Okay.
1700, in 1700 BC, that's 1400 years before Hippocrates, you can find the Kahum medical papyrus. Papyrus is paper.
Okay.
A compendium of information about women's diseases and pregnancies. In 1600 BC, that's 1300 years before Hippocrates, the Edward C. Smith Papyrus, a comparative surgical text and anatomical inquiry. It especially deals with the spinal column. 1550, let me jump to one here. The Ebers Papyrus. There is the whole book on it. A medical paper by Queen Hatshepsut, the first known queen in history, an Egyptian queen. A papyrus designed to show women how to develop a method to stop pregnancy, to insert into the vagina, made of the shrub of acacia and honey, which break down into lactic acid. Not only that, Monsanto, DuPont.
So we're talking about birth control.
Birth control in 1550 BC by the Africans.
It's a long time before the pill.
A few days before the pill.
But keep in mind, however, keep in mind that Europe is not yet in history.
European history. The Greeks ain't arrived yet.
All I ask one at a time.
All right.
Okay. Go ahead.
The civilization began. Homer have not written his Iliad and Odyssey. And the hero.
Okay, all the stuff that you're saying we can find this.
Look, I ain't nothing say if it's not here, it's either in Doc's library or mine back in New York. Nothing we take for granted.
What the books that we brought down?
And you saying they're not all written by black men?
No.
Anacalypsis
is written. Look now. Okay. Anacalypsis is a 2-volume work by Sir Godfrey Higgins, written in 1838 in England and published by Watson Company. The Golden Bow is a 13-volume book by Sir James Fraser, published simultaneously in the United States and England, and it was published in 1938. Bible Myths and the Parallels in Other Religions, written by Thomas W. Dones, and is published in 1887 by Watson Company, London, England. The Ruins of Empire by Conseil Volney is published, there it is. It's published in 1792 by simultaneously in England and France, done by a man who was with Napoleon Bonaparte.
Let me just say this about that. If we just give you the benefit of doubt and consider what you're saying to be true, I mean, you are chipping away at everything we've ever been taught, most of what we believe.
But you were taught it as slaves. Nobody.
Slave in 3 pieces?
Yes. We are no longer physical slaves, but we are mental slaves. And this is the worst form of slavery. Some of us believe that the Cadillac and the house on the beach makes us free. But it's the mind that makes us free.
Well, I'm just glad I have to ask the questions and don't have to defend any of this stuff. Go into something else for a minute. Tell us about some of those pictures, because I want to get as much into this hour as
well, this picture that you are looking at right here
The idea of Western society is basically a myth. Um, a lot of times in school and just people talking in general, they talk about Western society and they started from the Greeks to the Romans, democracy, to medieval kingdoms of Europe, directly correlated to, the power that America has attained itself in the Western Hemisphere. And it's completely a myth. everything that the Greeks learned, they admitted they came from Egypt. I think this video did a great way of constructing and breaking it down. Um, Africa was already in its prime, before the Europeans ever even had a real civilization. And a lot of the ideals of philosophy and uh, religion and civil, just aspects of civilization in general, the Africans passed along to the Europeans. And I think this did a great job at presenting it. And another thing that I want to pontificate on is the idea of now how the Western world uses Christianity, and I'm speaking specifically Great Britain, America, like these nations use Christianity as a clutch kind of for their society. And I think it's really funny because I feel like the reason that Christianity was able to spread and become the mainstream of European societies, not including the Europeans on the Mediterranean, so not including the Romans or the Greeks, but specifically, the ones that the kingdoms that the Rome or the tribes that the Romans was fighting against, the Gallic tribes or the Germanic tribes or the Britannic tribes. Well, the Germanic tribes ended up going into England and Gal too as well, Gold too as well. But basically, that the reason that they were able to associate them, it was a lot of forced conversion, in a sense. Even through the Viking Age with the Scandinavians, it was a lot of forced conversion. But I just think that having a religion that they can identify with a European being in a position of authority in the world stage, the Romans the Greeks were the first people to be in a position of authority with Alexander the Great, but the Romans did it on a whole nother level and maintained it for a vast amount of time, way longer than Alexander or his successor kingdoms were able to sustain their power. And I think that's a certain point where you see Europeans involved in world history, and being an authoritative figure in world history. And I think that's why it's so easy for people of European descent throughout history. I'm not talking about just modern day. Throughout history to associate with the religion. Um, think of whatever if you want to say the higher being of the universe is a man in the sky, whatever you believe, but that whatever has existential control over existence and creation itself would send the son of God, you know, that this will occur not thousands of years, not thousands of years before, when all those pyramids were built, not when the Arcadians or the Assyrians were running around, not not any of that time before that, not any of the Neolithical era, not not when the dinosaurs was around, not none of that time, but it would happen when white people are in a position of in an authoritative position. And I find it extremely interesting.
The first ever single instance of a single god was with Akhenaten out of Egypt, with Atenism, father of Tutankhamun. He tried to praise the sun disk god and try to get people to praise it too. It was a lot of turmoil. He ended up dying, and they went back to the traditional religions before that. Before Atenism was enforced. But regardless of that, I just want people to understand the political landscape at that time, especially with the idea of messianic leaders. That was normal for that time. Like a lot of people, like I've spoken with actual adults, like I spoke to them and they think like time started when Christ was born, like that's when the earth like was created. Like, a lot of people have surface level knowledge on things, on something that, ultimately they believe is the foundation of what existence is based off. And that's a bit confusing to me. Uh, because a lot of the things that's like complicated about society now has, was complicated about society 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 800, 900, 1000 BC, 2000 BC, 3000 BC. I give you a perfect example. I was going to talk about the messianic, the idea of messianic leaders being a norm for that time. And I'll give you a perfect example with Mithridates of Pontus during the Sulla Mariani Civil War between the Optimates and the Marianis, who was trying to fight uh,
for the rights basically of Italic allies, and a bit of political reforms, and trying to get a little bit more up upscaling for a regular worker basically, so you can, because Marius was a man who came from nothing and made himself something, and he wanted to not just pull a ladder, make it so others could have a chance. And Sulla and Optimates didn't necessarily agree with that, and it was civil war because of it. But you have Mithridates, a Pontic leader, the leader of Pontus, who was really seen as a messianic leader of the Greeks and the Hellenistic Persians, and it was really an emphasis on the sun in connection with him too. So you see kind of a correlation there. But I think it's important, to understand like complicated things was happening at this time that similar to things we see now. Fighting against the aristocracy, fighting against the oligarchy and aristocracy of the elite. You have with the Gracchus brothers in Rome. They were assassinated for trying to do land reforms and debt forgiveness programs. Like they were literally assassinated. Caesar, the people say he was assassinated for being a tyrant. Go read Michael Peralti's book about Caesar. I think he did a excellent job, making a case and making a bold statement saying, he was assassinated because of his debt forgiveness and his land reforms. Like, yeah, he went and stole from Gaul, killed 1 million of them, caused tragedies, but he came back and he literally gave away money to Romans, and did debt forgiveness programs and land recreation acts, and took slave labor off, off these agricultural fields, and put people to work and give them the opportunity, so they wasn't just living in buildings that fell on top of them. A million people living in apartment tenement buildings, all on top of each other in the city of Rome. Like he wanted to expand and give people a more proportionate outlook on life. So kudos to him for that. Not kudos for all the death and destruction. He had to close to the Gallics to get it done, but he was a man of his time and with city states, and that's a whole nother separate conversation. But I just wanted to point that out, like the idea of messianic leaders and political turmoil, socioeconomic turmoil is nothing new to our time. Like this is things that have been going on before the so-called birth of Christ. Um, what's up, guys? I got some clips from Caesar Messiah coming up. While I might not agree with everything that Atwill proposed, I definitely think that he has some correct estimations there in terms of like the typology and the connection with Josephus. I think that's inarguable. Um, and he pointed out a lot of things that I learned. Like I didn't know his Vespasian's niece was like actually like one of the first saints. So I think it's definitely some connection to like the early institution there for sure. Um, but I thought it definitely the reason I'm adding the clips is because I thought it gave a great observation of the political landscape in terms of like specifically in terms of like Rome and having the dynasty switch over from the Julio-Claudian dynasty over to the Flavian dynasty. And it's kind of like a repetitive pattern that you see throughout history. And the reason I'm emphasizing that point is particularly like you see it through Egypt, you see it through Greece, you see it through Rome. In terms of the Rome examples, you see it with not only the Flavians, but you see it with Septimius Severus, you see it with Aurelian, you see it with Constantine, where they kind of like harness a religion as like a method of control, especially like when you have a power vacuum and you have a bunch of pretenders, trying to make their mark. Um, so I thought it gave a great, observation there, and I thought it did a great job of explaining it, and I think it gives a pretty solid job of explaining, the turmoil of Judea at the time, and how things transpired. So jump into that.
Of this era, many of the answers provided by the Church and Christian scholars do not hold up to rigorous scrutiny.
This is really important for our culture, to understand where Christianity came from.
No doubt Christians have done a lot of good for the world, but then there are other Christians, often the most dogmatic, who create wars, hatred, and other harm under the disguise of religion. In studying how Christianity emerged, many of our scholars agree that it was used as a political tool to control the masses of the day, and it is still being used this way today.
The problem is that Christianity has been used as a tool by government that uses the goodness in people against them. For example, support for the wars in the Middle East has been preached to evangelical Christians as a way to speed up the end of days. This is just one example of the way that propaganda is used to control and manipulate the populace. Actually, according to my study of the ancient texts, the second coming of the Christ has already occurred.
Maybe we need to expand the possible answers about how Christianity originated, and deeper questions need to be asked. Maybe we need to examine what political motives were behind the formation of the Christian religion.
I think it's a requirement of alert citizens to know how the Gospels were written, why they were written, who produced them, what was the purpose and back of all this. This is good citizenry. Everyone should be involved in this.
Today, we live on the brink of an immense paradigm shift. And this modern time is very parallel to the era in which Christianity emerged. Studying this ancient era can give us the perspective needed for coming up with solutions to today's problems and for helping create the better world that we envision.
And the penny dropped that Jesus, as a human being, never existed.
The presentation of the Jesus character, it's somewhat of a composite of many messianic leaders of the time.
Well, let's just go back to the drawing board, and we'll leave aside all of the assumptions of Christian history, and let's just look at the text afresh and consider every possibility. Let's open the whole game up.
Can you think that Christianity is really paganism by a different name? Now it feels completely obvious.
Some of us are saying that this was a sun god turned into a Jewish man.
In all of this, we're dealing with literature. We're not dealing with history. So the answer is no, there is no history to this character of Jesus. It's entirely a literary creation.
Some of our Bible scholars are mavericks, working outside the restrictions of mainstream religious institutions. This allows them the freedom to provide fresh insights and draw some startling conclusions about how Christianity was formed.
I began reading a number of books on the subject. This turned into a decade-long research.
For Joseph Atwill, the key was in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the only Jewish literature ever discovered from the 1st century AD or CE, the time that Jesus would have been preaching among the Jews.
The characters in the Dead Sea Scrolls were militaristic, and you could see that this movement wanted to push the foreigners out of Israel. They were fundamentalists, whereas the characters in the Gospel are different. They are pacifistic. They are turning the other cheek. They're giving to Caesar what is Caesar's. How did a movement like Christianity come to exist in a region that was occupied by Roman soldiers and had Jewish zealots within it that were going to push these Romans out? How was that possible? I began studying the other two major works of the era, the New Testament and Wars of the Jews by Josephus, a Roman court historian who described the war between the Romans and the Jews in the 1st century. While reading these works side by side, I noticed an amazing connection between them. Certain events from the ministry of Jesus seem to closely parallel episodes from the military campaign of Roman Caesar Titus Flavius, a campaign which took place 40 years after Jesus supposedly lived. My efforts to understand these connections led me to an incredible discovery. Christianity had been invented by a little-known family of Roman Caesars, the Flavians, and they left us documents to prove it.
The Flavians are not a household name, and yet it's the Flavians who completely reshaped the Roman Empire. In Rome, of course, there's the Colosseum, which is understood to be the best-known monument of the ancient Roman Empire, perhaps. The Colosseum is, in fact, a Flavian construction produced during the Flavian period. It's under the Flavians that both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity take shape.
Why would the Flavians be interested in creating religions? Much like today, their era was marked by political power struggles, a bankrupt economy, religious conflicts, and endless wars. In the midst of this turmoil, the Flavians seized control of the Roman Empire and ushered in an immense paradigm shift. To understand the Flavians' rise to power, we need to go back to the reign of the previous powerful rulers, the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Beginning with Julius Caesar in the year 49 BCE, the Julio-Claudians ruled Rome for over 100 years, transforming the government from a republic into an empire. This family contained all the famous Caesars: Julius, who predated the time of Jesus; Augustus, who was Caesar at the time of Jesus' supposed birth; Tiberius, who ruled during Jesus' supposed death, followed by the infamous Caligula; then Claudius, and ending the Julio-Claudian dynasty with Nero, whose reign begins in 54 CE.
The Julio-Claudians enjoyed a godlike status until the family degenerated and began to damage the Roman Empire.
By the time of Nero, his famous decadence was bankrupting the empire, and the Jews of Judea were staging a huge rebellion against their Roman rulers.
Judea was one of the many conquered provinces that made up the Roman Empire. This region, which was also known as Palestine, was controlled by a family that served as Rome's tax collector, the Herods.
They were a Greco-Arab family, somewhat possibly Judaized, though only Judaized when it was convenient to please the subjects they were given, who were put in power in Palestine and destroyed the previous Jewish ruling family, the Maccabean family, root and stalk.
Besides being heavily taxed and ruled by a non-Jewish family put in power by Rome, the Jews were further inflamed by the requirement that a statue of the Caesar be placed for worship in every temple throughout the empire.
In the Roman Empire, you could pretty much have any god you want, but legally you had to submit to the emperor as a god as well. You had to at least acknowledge that the Roman leader was also a divine figure. But the Jews would not have any of it.
It's fundamental to Jewish belief that you shall make no graven images. It's one of the commandments given at Sinai by God. So the Jews never made representations of God.
The Jews had a very different type of religion. They had a religion which was much more focused on the book and less focused upon cultic statues. This presented a real problem for the Romans. They tried to install statues of Caesar, but the Jews weren't going to buy that at all. In fact, it aggravated them, it enraged them. And the Romans really, I think, didn't understand this. It's not statues, it's books.
And those books contained what are known as the Jewish Messianic prophecies.
The thing that most moved the Jews,
beginning with their own court historian, Josephus.
Josephus arrives back in Rome with Titus. He becomes an adopted member of the Flavian family. An amazing turn of events for the Jewish turncoat. he becomes Flavius Josephus. Josephus at this time begins writing the history of the war, and he records that Titus gave him the Jewish scripture. Josephus's histories have always been associated with the origins of Christianity.
Time and again you can find parallels between what Josephus writes and what turns up in the Gospels. It's a powerful evidence of their true origin.
In reading the works of Josephus side by side with the Gospels, scholars have noticed parallels between the two works. It appears as though the history of Josephus records events that fulfill the prophecies of the Old and New Testaments. Early Christians understood this connection. In fact, when the Bible first began to be printed in the Middle Ages, it included the history of Josephus.
He was employed to write the official history that we have. The other histories from this period have been destroyed ruthlessly by the Romans. Josephus tells us this in very chilling passages, how the Romans exerted complete control of the literature of this period. There were alternative histories of the Jewish war written. Well, the Romans rounded up the writers of those histories and executed them. They rounded up all the copies of those histories and destroyed them. That is to say, they ruthlessly wiped out any alternative history, so that the only history we have is written by Josephus. And let's remember who Josephus was.
Chief propagandist of the Flavian dynasty, and he was very, very successful. He moved back to Rome. He was given an apartment in the emperor's own townhouse, and he was appointed the chronicler of the Roman Jewish War, using Vespasian's own diaries of the events.
Also in the pages of his history, Josephus declares that the Jews' Messiah or Christ is none other than Flavius Vespasian and his dynastic family.
To put it succinctly, Josephus says that there was a prophecy that a world ruler would come out of Palestine. The Jews thought this applied to one of their own. They were wrong in their interpretations. He used the most cynical interpretation. He applied it to the rise of the Roman emperor in Palestine.
Josephus recorded that the Messianic prophecies foresaw not a Jew, but Vespasian and his dynasty. In fact, all of the Flavian historians recorded that the Flavian Caesar was the Christ.
It was important to the Flavians that they be seen as the Christ, as divine and godlike, and this was not mere vanity. The Julio-Claudians before them had already established that presenting themselves as gods was a powerful tool in controlling their subjects. When the Flavians took over the throne, they inherited an enormous bureaucracy that was already in place, the imperial cult, which was dedicated to promoting the idea of Caesar as a god.
Another part of the puzzle is the Roman imperial cult. Why is it important? Well, because it coincides with that same period of time as the emergence of the Christ cult.
You had a whole social community. The whole social structure of these conquered territories was governed by the imperial cult. And if you wanted to succeed, the key social community to join was the imperial cult, because that's where all the movers and shakers were.
This idea of the emperor becoming an object of worship was well established in the Roman system before Vespasian and Titus came along. It was prevalent in all major centres. It had its own priesthood. There was a ceremony, an annual celebration, annual games for the imperial cult. Now, it had many characteristics which would later colour the Christian cult.
They were therefore legitimate. Their power base was the Roman aristocracy, the Roman nobility. All of that collapsed into this power vacuum. Vespasian was declared emperor by the troops, by the Roman army. So effectively, it was a military coup. With the change of dynasty, they have to create a whole mythology to legitimise that dynasty. At the same time, they're creating a whole mythology to counter Jewish messianism. Somewhere along the line, those two things get mixed together.
When Vespasian died, Titus began the process of having his father deified. This is a complicated process because only the Roman Senate can bestow on an individual the title of deus or God. Titus came to the Senate and presented evidence that the life of his father had been divine. Certainly this would have included the military campaign that the Flavians waged through Judea. And it's at this time I think the Gospels were written, because the theological structure in the Gospels of a God the Father and the Son of God is the same one that Titus would have been presenting to the Roman Senate. Well, the Roman Senate did accept Titus's evidence, and Vespasian was deified and became a god. Titus therefore became a son of God.
The Arch of Titus that still stands in modern Rome today is inscribed with a dedication to the divine Titus, son of the divine Vespasian, or son of a god. This imperial cult, set up to worship Caesar as God, also provided the basis for the structure of the Roman Catholic Church.
Now, the rituals, paraphernalia, and symbols of paganism were transferred wholesale to the Christian church. The most obvious and clear example is where the title of the pagan chief priest of Rome, the Pontifex Maximus, became the title of the Pope, the Christian Pope. If you look at who held the original bishop positions in the Catholic Church in those early times, you will see that they are members of the same pagan aristocracy. They simply changed their clothing a little bit. They wore the same garments, but they wore slightly different headdresses. They had become from being a priest of a pagan cult to being a priest of Rome.
Where the Vatican now stands, there was once a pagan temple which celebrated the mysteries of a dying and resurrecting God-man who wasn't Jesus. There are many churches in Rome, I've been to a few, where you go above into the church and there is Jesus, and you go underneath and there's a little sanctuary of Mithras, and it's basically the same figure.
So the Roman plot to invent Christianity is just so clever when you think about it. Through the Pope, who is God's representative on earth, they no longer needed expensive standing armies, wars, and punishment of disobedient peasants. They could, through religion, rule their subjects.
Over time, Roman Christianity propagated throughout the empire by way of the mass media of the day, the Roman roads. The Romans must have approved of this new religion because, as some scholars ask, if the Gospels really were Jewish literature about a Roman sentenced criminal, why wouldn't they have been destroyed?
One of the really surprising things for me was to realize the extent of Roman control of propaganda and of literature. So that when you suddenly get all of this Christian literature arising in this period, one has to ask, well, how did that happen? The conclusion that one has to reach is that that could not have happened without some degree of complicity on the part of the Romans, so that one is led to the conclusion that the Romans must be involved in the production of this literature.
To produce and disseminate this literature was a huge undertaking, and the Flavians undoubtedly had collaborators. We know they were funded by the wealthiest family in the world at this time, the Alexanders, a Jewish family who served as Rome's tax collectors in Egypt. Like the Herods in Judea, the Alexanders had strong motivation to keep the Jews' messianic movement from threatening their position and their wealth. One of their family members was Philo of Alexandria, a famous Jewish theologian who was already writing works that combined Jewish beliefs with the modern Greek and Roman pagan beliefs of the day.
Time period.
I believe that the Gospels were actually written under the control of the Herods, the Alexanders, and the Flavians. These families had the motivation to create Christianity And with the expertise in Judaism that the Alexanders and the Herods had, they had the actual technical ability to come up with these stories that are fulfillment of Hebraic prophecies.
So it seems the Flavians had the motivation, the means, and the collaborations through which they likely constructed and began disseminating Christianity. And if our scholars are correct, one of the documents they left behind are the Gospels themselves.
I began working on the study of the Gospels in the 1970s, and I look at texts in terms of how were these composed, what does understanding their structure tell you about who wrote them and why they were written. These texts were not independent Jewish texts, but they were created as literary works using classical literary models.
If we expect that this is the testimony of witnesses, we've got a major problem. We actually have 4 anonymous documents. They were not written by the named people on those documents. This is simply church tradition that the Gospels are so named according to Mark, according to Matthew. So this idea that the Gospels are reliable testimony is patent nonsense.
Why are the Gospels called Gospels? That's a critical question. The word gospel in Greek is evangelion, and it means good news of military victory. Whose military victory are we celebrating here in these Gospels? Well, it seems to me that we are celebrating clearly the Roman military victory, because these events, the Battle of Gadara, the Battle of the Lake of Galilee, the successful Battle of Jerusalem, these are battles that the Romans won. Why are the Gospels celebrating battles that the Jews lost if these things were written by the Jews?
The fact that the Gospels are known to us in Greek and not in Aramaic or Hebrew is, I think, just evidence of their authorship. They were not written by any followers of Jesus who would have surely spoken Aramaic, and if they had been fishermen and simple folk, they would not have had the literal skills to write them anyway.
If we look closely, there actually are clues in the Gospels that point to who the true authors were.
A lot of the Christian literature advocates turning away from the Jewish law and obeying Roman law. Well, this fits perfectly into Roman propaganda purposes. And then you have, in general, the portrayal of Jesus as the peaceful Jew who is wandering around in what is depicted as a sort of pastoral scenes, talking to fishermen and farmers and so forth, when in fact, this is a war zone. Judea is a war zone. And you ask yourself, well, why is it not portrayed as a war zone?
I mean, they really had it down pat. They have Jesus saying, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, which is basically in response to talking about money. Whose benefit would that be? It's so blatantly obvious.
The perception of Roman characters in the Gospels, they're all interpreted in a favourable light. They are pro-Roman. They do not depict the Romans as the forces of evil. They reverse that. It's the Jews who become the forces of darkness. It's very striking that various passages in the Gospels refer to the Jews as some people separate from the heroes of Jesus and his disciples. The Jews are those who object. The Jews are those who try to thwart the divine plan. Now, that gives us a clue, certainly, to who were the true authors of this book.
They are works of literature created by people who are trained in Jewish literature, but whose values are pro-Roman.
The Romans wanted to promote anti-Semitism, and so they arranged the story of the beloved man God, Jesus Christ, to appear as if the Jews had brought about his death. Because of this, the Jews would have to suffer anti-Semitism throughout history.
So this was a piece of work that could not have been done except by a fairly established literary team, such as the literary team that was in Rome actually writing the books of Josephus. I mean, that was written by a literary team, and it was written as one of the attempts to give prominence to the Flavian Caesars, which the Gospels also do. So it is extremely likely that the Gospels, as a form of epic, designed to magnify allegorically the Roman Caesars, is also written at the court of the Flavian emperors.
But the Jesus story takes place many decades before the Flavians came to power. Why would the Flavians create a work about a Jewish Messiah that wasn't even from their own era?
The Gospels were very precisely backdated 40 years. Jesus' ministry was started in 30 CE, exactly 40 years from the destruction of the temple. His ministry ends at Passover, 33 CE, which is 40 years before the end of the Jewish-Roman War, which occurred at Passover in 73 CE with the famous Battle of Masada.
The Gospels are backdated into the period of Pontius Pilate. That is to say, before the First Jewish War, which is to say, in the Julio-Claudian period. But this is typical of Flavian literature. It's a Flavian technique. What they do is they backdate this story into the period of their enemies, namely the Julio-Claudians. And so, generation after generation of Christian scholar and even secular historians go hunting in the Julio-Claudian period for the origins of the Gospels. They don't really find any answers there. There are allusions in the Gospels to the destruction of the temple. The most reasonable answer to that is that these texts were written after the destruction of the temple. That is to say, in the Flavian period, after the change of dynasty.
This backdating of the story of Jesus Christ, 40 years earlier from the time the Gospels may actually have been written, explains why many of the prophecies of Jesus came true within exactly 40 years.
What does this all add up to? In my view, the thing that is most significant is the research by Joseph Atwill in his book Caesar's Messiah, which suggests that the Gospels were actually created as works of Roman propaganda at the end of the Roman-Jewish War under the reign of the Flavian emperors, that is Titus Caesar and Vespasian Caesar. And if you end up worshipping Jesus, what you will really end up doing is worshipping Caesar in disguise.
This may have been how the Flavians finally got the Jews to worship Caesar as a god, by giving them Jesus Christ, a Messiah more to the Romans' liking. But is there any actual history to this character? Where did he really come from?
The mystery to me begins with his very name. In Greek, Jesus means Savior and Christ means the Messiah. This didn't strike me as something you would call a young child.
These two words are already important within Judaism before Jesus Christ supposedly existed. Major biblical figures to a Jewish Greek-speaking populace would already be called Christ. Their ears would already be acclimated to accepting this title. So it isn't just a unique name of a single person that just suddenly popped up.
What did we actually know about Jesus Christ the man?
I don't think that Jesus can be historically defended. I don't think there's any evidence that we can extend to that particular Jesus.
So when you actually set out to investigate the historical Jesus as opposed to the Christ of faith, you very abruptly enter a void. You find that whereas you might imagine the core details of Jesus are readily known and accessible, you actually discover there's no such thing.
Further, there had never been any archaeologic evidence of Jesus Christ that had ever been discovered.
You cannot find an established and incontrovertible biography of Jesus at all. It doesn't exist. You enter a strange twilight zone of early Christian belief. What we have here is not a movement that's grown on the accretion of legends on a real flesh and blood man, but instead the the development of a religious movement around the idea of a man.
There isn't even an actual physical description of what Jesus looked like anywhere in the Gospels.
The presentation of the Jesus character, it's somewhat of a composite of many messianic leaders of the time. Many messianic leaders of the time, most or all of whom came to a bad end, usually by crucifixion, because crucifixion was the Roman punishment for seditious activity.
And the penny dropped that Jesus, as a human being, never existed.
Science and belief in prophecy. So they said, okay, they want a prophet, let's give them one.
It seems that in the construction of the literary character Jesus Christ, the Roman authors borrowed religious concepts not only from Judaism, but also from other gods and religions that they knew. Some scholars have noticed the similarities between the story of Jesus and the ancient pagan mysteries.
In ancient mythology, we find this whole strain of thought called solar mythology. Many gods are taking on solar attributes because as agricultural communities become more important, the sun becomes a big focus. The most obvious reasons of planting and harvesting. The sun is then personified, so now we have a male sun god. It becomes a religion in many parts of the world. Christianity usurped a tremendous amount of sun worship. Some of us are saying that this was a sun god turned into a Jewish man. This December 25th birthday was in fact the winter solstice. This is really, in fact, the birth of the god of light. December 25th actually is the end of a 3-day period of when the sun stands still. The sun appears to be dying as the days become shorter, and the sun is reborn at that point.
Across the ancient world, there was this form of experiential and philosophical spirituality in these mystery cults, or mystery schools. And at the center of these schools you would find a mythos, which was an initiatory myth, a symbolic myth, which would help people who were going through the initiatory process come to this spiritual awakening, this knowledge, this what they called gnosis. And what you see in these myths is the elements that will later become the Jesus story.
Let's ask the question, is Jesus developed from pre-existing literary characters? Jesus has certain episodes in this so-called life, and each one of them can be traced to a prior representation of that type.
If you look at the elements which we found in the pagan mystery school myths, you find the story of a dying and resurrecting Son of God who's born of a virgin, has 12 disciples, turns water into wine at a wedding, he brings a new religion of love, is accused of heresy or of provocation by the authorities, is put to death, sometimes by crucifixion. And then if you want to commune with the God-man, you take bread and wine, and then you can come to eternal life. Well, all of this is, of course, Christianity.
Easter itself is a long pre-Christian celebration of the resurrection of spring from the death of winter.
This is an ancient shamanic rite you'll find all over the world, that you go through a ritual death where you get reborn, but you're reborn as an awake being. So you've died just to your lower nature and woken up to your higher nature.
You can find them in the Old Testament, in the Jewish mythology as well. It isn't just pagan parallels. I mean, the New Testament, for example, the Ascension. We have an ascension with the Old Testament figure of Elijah, and it's a very dramatic ascension.
Elisha-Elijah cycle. These are two Jewish prophets, one followed on from the other, which have many of the story elements found in Jesus. For example, there is a multiplication of food miracle, there is a raising of the dead miracle, there is a water miracle, there is ultimately an ascension to heaven miracle. Is this fulfillment, or is this simply copying of a useful theme?
You can see where they just used Old Testament characters and scriptures as a blueprint to create this new one.
A lot of the ethics of Christianity actually were around before Christianity. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you is in fact from the Old Testament. Jesus didn't make that up. Many of the other aspects of Christian ethics, many things which we might like to applaud as very good aspects of Christian ethics, can be found in the Stoic philosophy in Rome, which, by the way, was exactly the philosophical and ethical school promoted by the Flavians.
There's little that is original about Jesus. If one separates from his words advice that was in the interest of the Roman imperial family, all that you have left are snippets of widely known philosophies, truisms, and concepts that came directly from prior Hebraic literature.
The reason I am now convinced there's no historical Jesus, which seems a real, whoa, to people who are not familiar with the idea, is a combination of things. First of all, there's no evidence for an historical man which stands up to proper scrutiny. Secondly, is the story of Jesus is full of these motifs which come from the pagan mysteries. And the third reason is because in the early Christian movement, there's these two types of Christians, certainly by the 2nd century, which I think of as Gnostics and literalists. What marks out the literalists, who will become the Roman Empire and the Roman Catholic Church, is that they've got an historical man. What marks out the Gnostics is that they see it allegorically, and their great heresy is that Christ didn't come in the flesh. Now, the winners write history, and the history books have been written by the literalists.
And all of the tradition about the Romans trying to torture and suppress Christians, these traditions are correct. They definitely persecuted the messianic, militaristic Christians, and they certainly would have frowned on the Gnostic, independent thinking Christians, but the Roman pacifistic, giving to Caesar what is Caesar Christians, that group would have been promoted.
Which makes it perfect for the Roman Empire. And it's a fascist empire. It's got a very simple message: just believe this, you don't have to transform, and you have to go through the authorities, through the bishops, through the state, ultimately. It's the perfect thing for them to pick up, and that's what they do.
Our scholars agree that the Gospels are complex literary creations, drawing from both pagan and Jewish myths. But Joseph Atwill goes a step further to say that the Flavians
one outside his movement write about it. If hundreds saw him alive, why do the earliest Roman and Jewish historians ignore him completely? These are not questions of faith, these are questions of evidence, and the deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes. Christianity did not become widely accepted as true because of miracles, eyewitnesses, or overwhelming proof. It became true because it co-opted its rivals, attached itself to power, and rewrote the record after the fact. I know that's uncomfortable to hear, especially if you've been taught that Christianity exploded across the ancient world because of how compelling and obvious it was. But what we find in actual history is very different. Let's take a look at the record. Let's start with 1st to 3rd century. The educated rejected it. The earliest philosophers, scientists, and statesmen who lived within 100 to 200 years of the gospel claims rejected Christianity outright. Not quietly, not skeptically, but explicitly, publicly, and intellectually. Celsus, writing in the late 2nd century, called Christianity a superstition for the uneducated, a movement that rejects reason and appeals to fools and the unlearned. Galen, one of the most respected medical minds in the empire, grouped Christians with those who make up stories and refuse to demonstrate what they believe. To paraphrase, he stated Christians and Jews accept dogma without inquiry. They preach certainty but flee from reason. They believe not because they have proven, but because they have been told. And then there was Lucian, a Roman satirist, mocked early Christians for worshiping a crucified con man and embracing death like it was a badge of honor. And then Tacitus, perhaps the most respected Roman historian, didn't just reject Christianity, he called it a pernicious superstition, born from shame and followed by the gullible. To him, Christianity likely looked like an irrational emotional cult that weaponized suffering and ignorance. These weren't disillusioned atheists. These were the intellectual elite of the empire, people trained in logic, philosophy, history, and public life, and they saw Christianity as irrational, fabricated, and socially dangerous. Let's talk about the silence around the supernatural. The Gospels don't just claim Jesus rose from the dead, they claim the earth shook, the sky went dark, and the tombs opened with dead saints walking through Jerusalem for everyone to see. Matthew chapter 27, verse 52 through 53 reads, "The tombs were open, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many." That's not a private vision. That's not an inner conviction. That's a mass resurrection in a major capital during Passover in front of thousands. And yet, not one Roman historian mentions it. Not Tacitus, not Suetonius, not Pliny, not even Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher who lived in Jerusalem's shadow and wrote volumes about Jewish religious movements, but never mentions Jesus, the crucifixion, or walking dead saints. Nothing. The only people who wrote these events down were believers decades later in theological texts with no external verification or proof of contemporary confirmation. And we don't even know who those writers were. Even Paul, writing earlier than the Gospel, says Jesus appeared to over 500 people at once after his resurrection, but he never names a single one. There are no preserved testimonies, no names, no official records. If 500 people had actually seen a man rise from the dead and dead saints walking the streets, the Roman governors would have been writing home about it. The temple authorities would have documented it. The philosophers of Athens would have debated it, but we get silence, which is exactly what you'd expect if those things actually didn't happen. Constantine was co-opted, not converted. By the early 4th century, Christianity was still fragmented, persecuted in waves, and widely distrusted. Enter Constantine. Now, here's what you may have heard. That Constantine saw a vision of a cross in the sky before battle, heard a voice from heaven, and converted to Christianity on the spot, changing history forever by making Christianity the official state religion. But here's what actually happened. There is no record from Constantine himself of any vision in 312. The first time this story appears is years later in Christian text, and it changes depending on who's telling it. In fact, Constantine continued honoring Sol Invictus, the Roman sun god, on his coins well after that battle. He didn't get baptized until he was dying, and even then it was by an Arian bishop, a theological outsider condemned by the very council Constantine supposedly championed. So what really happened? Constantine didn't convert. He didn't believe. He didn't write theological works, recite creeds, or claim Jesus as Lord. What he did do was allow Christianity to rise into imperial toleration, and Christian leaders rushed to claim him as their own. The vision of Constantine is not just embellished, it is entirely post hoc. There is no record in 312 that he had any Christian revelation, made any public acknowledgement of Christ, or attributed his victory to the Christian God. To suggest otherwise, even cautiously, is to narrate legend, not history. It wasn't Constantine who co-opted Christianity. It was Christianity that co-opted Constantine, wrapping the emperor's image in sacred myth, forging a new narrative of divine favor, and using the machinery of state to crush rival sects and rewrite its own history. So how does Christianity move from tolerated to true? So if Constantine never actually became a Christian, how did Christianity go from tolerated to true? From street cult to state creed? The answer isn't miracle, martyrdom, or mass revelation. its imperial enforcement, and it happened in stages. The first stage is it was legalized, but still one among many. In 313, Constantine and Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity, not declaring it true, not even making it official, just legalizing it alongside all other religions. Christianity was now permitted, not promoted, and most citizens of the empire kept worshiping Jupiter, Apollo, Mithras, or Sol Invictus. So what changed? Well, stage 2 is the fight for theological control. By the time of the Council of Nicaea in 325, Christianity wasn't unified, it was fracturing further than ever before. Who was Jesus really? Was he equal to God? Was he created? Was he subordinate? The Arians said one thing, the Nicenes said another, and other sects said Jesus wasn't divine at all. Constantine didn't care what theology won, he just wanted the fighting to stop. That's why he called the council, that's why he funded the bishops, that's why he enforced the Nicene Creed, not because he believed it, but because he needed to keep the peace. And he didn't even enforce it consistently. He flipped sides later and exiled the very bishop Athanasius who had championed the winning view. There's also stage 3. Christianity becomes the state religion in 380 CE. It wasn't until Theodosius I, nearly 50 years later, that Christianity was finally declared true in the legal sense. In 380, he issued the Edict of Thessalonica, which reads, "We authorize the followers of this law to assume the title of Catholic Christians. The rest shall be branded as heretics and may expect the wrath of God and the punishment of our authority." Let's be clear, this wasn't about the resurrection. This wasn't about fulfilled prophecy. This wasn't about scripture or miracles or apostles. It was imperial legislation enforced by the army, funded by the treasury, and backed by the bishop class. And with it, Christianity went from being a religion among many to the only legal form of truth in the Roman world. Belief was no longer a matter of evidence. It was now a matter of law. Which brings us to stage 4, syncretism and absorption. This took place in the late 4th to 6th century. After becoming the state religion, Christianity didn't just suppress other beliefs, it absorbed them. Pagan festivals were renamed, Saturnalia becomes Christmas, Roman religious language and titles were retrofitted into the church hierarchy. Saints replaced household gods, virgin cults echoed those of Isis or Demeter. Christianity became culturally dominant not just by legislation, but by blending with older traditions while claiming it had always been the truth. This wasn't theological purity, it was adaptive imperial branding. And then there's stage 5. Conversion by colonization and violence, the 5th through the 15th centuries. Once Christianity dominated Rome, it didn't stop there. For the next 1,000 years, mission meant military conquest. Conversion meant submission or death. Whole regions were baptized at sword point. From Charlemagne's forced conversion of Saxons, to the Crusades against Muslims and Jews, to the colonization of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Christianity wasn't spreading because of truth, it was spreading because of unearned and unchecked power. What began as a persecuted minority movement became a state ideology, a cultural monopoly, and eventually a justification for global domination. In this next section, I want us to talk about some forgeries. Let's be honest. If we found out today that a political movement or religious group had falsified its foundational text on purpose, we'd call it what it is, fraud. But in early Christianity, that wasn't just common, it was defended. One of the most influential early Christian historians, Eusebius of Caesarea, wrote this in the early 4th century. It may be lawful and fitting to use falsehood. In early Christianity, that wasn't just common, it was defended. One of the most influential early Christian historians, Eusebius of Caesarea, wrote this in the early 4th century. It may be lawful and fitting to use falsehood.
So I think you get the hint of where this series is going. This is part one. I'm gonna put a little bit of bonus clips towards the end of this, so you kind of see where part two is heading. Um, Start getting into more present day effects of the Abrahamic faith, and how it has effects on us. From you look at Gaza and Netanyahu referring to the Palestinians as Amalek. That's modern present day. You look at political actions in the United States, predominantly by evangelical Christians. You know what I mean? From look at the modern era, from the invasion of Iraq and their full-fledged support, where 1 million Iraqi civilians was killed. Women, children. Same thing, similar thing we seen in Gaza, and how that nation has never really been able to reset itself. You see the people calling for war right now in Iran, a lot of times referring to biblical terms or biblical ideas, and it's just it's a common thread. And even to civil rights and the actions of black people, and both the actions of white nationalist Christians. So I think it's going to be an interesting conversation going forward, and I look forward to start getting working on it and presenting it to you guys. But I hope you enjoy the next two clips, because you kind of see where it's going. First clip is Marco Rubio just openly announcing that the West needs to go back to open colonialization and imperial empire. I think that speaks for itself. And then the second clip talks about how in the recent weeks, black people just lost basically what they got dogs bit on them for during the civil rights movement. For representation. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the clip, and I hope you kind of get the idea where we're going from here.
State Marco Rubio, who explicitly called for a... Great to see you.
Good to see you, sir.
Good to see you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So most noteworthy speech that occurred there was Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who explicitly called for a return to colonialism and sharing the spoils of that colonialism with European allies. Let's go ahead and take a listen to a little bit of that.
We cannot continue to allow those who blatantly and openly threaten our citizens and endanger our global stability to shield themselves behind abstractions of international law which they themselves routinely violate. This is the path that President Trump and the United States has embarked upon. It is the path we ask you here in Europe to join us on. It is a path we have walked together before and hope to walk together again. For 5 centuries, before the end of the Second World War, the West had been expanding. Its missionaries, its pilgrims, its soldiers, its explorers pouring out from its shores to cross oceans, settle new continents, build vast empires extending out across the globe. But in 1945, for the first time since the age of Columbus, it was contracting. Europe was in ruins. Half of it lived behind an iron curtain, and the rest looked like it would soon follow. The great Western empires had entered into terminal decline, accelerated by godless communist revolutions and by anti-colonial uprisings that would transform the world and drape the red hammer and sickle across vast swaths of the map in the years to come. Against that backdrop, then as now, many came to believe that the West's age of dominance had come to an end, and that our future was destined to be a faint and feeble echo of our past. But together, our predecessors recognized that decline was a choice, and it was a choice they refused to make.
You can see there at the end him getting a standing ovation, apparently, from many of the Europeans in the room. Dr. Parsi, what did you make of his remarks?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is just to look at the remarks themselves, and then also the European reaction. Here you have a Secretary of State that is decrying the end of the Cold War. He's decrying the fact that the West is no longer expansionist, decrying the collapse of Western, not American, empires, decrying decolonization, and the end of Western empires. And gets a standing ovation for that. I mean, there's so much to unpack here, because at the end of the day, you could see that the Europeans, by standing up and giving a standing ovation for this, are willing to accept any basis for a partnership with the United States as long as they're allowed to continue to live in the illusion that they matter to the United States. It didn't matter that the values that he was putting forward here are values that vast majority of Europe already has abandoned decades ago. But Rubio was going back to this era of empire, imperialism, colonization as something positive, and he got a standing ovation for that.
Yeah, I mean, putting those together, Dr. Parsi, it seems to me that they abandon it internally. But we've talked here before, if you look at the European stance on, let's say, Iran, they're very quick to say not the legitimate government, it has no legitimacy. On Venezuela, they de facto supported the United. Their only complaint is there wasn't a full-on regime change. They fully believe in no colonialism or expansion on their continent, but outside of their continent, they seem fine with it. So is this just a reconciling of their own hypocrisy? What do you think?
So I think some of these things that you mentioned obviously are true, but they're more recent developments. This vast abandonment of international law, for instance. Not to say that Europe always has been perfect or anything like that, but this is a more recent development. The whole tone at the Munich conference this time was more regime change than I've ever seen before. Wow. And I think, again, these are some new developments. Not to say that there hasn't been a route for it or that it's been always perfectly different before, but remember, 2003, the Europeans went out of their way to stop the regime change war in Iraq, and they paid a very high price for it. Back then, Germany, France took the lead, and they had all of Europe, with the exception of some eastern states and the UK, on their side, fighting against that war because of its illegality, because of its neocolonial character, and because it was regime change. That is not what we're seeing right now. So in many ways, Europe has already changed, but this is still taking them a much more explicit step in the direction that it should embrace its colonial past. It should embrace its pursuit of empire. And I have to tell you, as much as the Europeans are increasingly saying, look, we can't stand up for international law, we just have to do whatever it wants to say, the idea that there would be an embrace of empire is still a step that I don't think most Europeans have been willing to take so far.
It was very, it was very disturbing to me, but it was also, I thought, extraordinary the way it almost seemed he was rebuking the lessons that were learned from World War II. I mean, World War II, one of the things that's taken from this is, when you have an expansionist power, like Germany, for example, this is a disaster for humanity. It's a problem for a variety of nations. We need to put these institutions in place. And by the way, I feel like this gets lost from the Trump administration. We set up those institutions to benefit us. It has been a tremendous benefit to the United States of America, and then we run around acting like we're the victims of these institutions that we ourselves set up. But I thought the almost rebuke of the learnings of World War II was something that was pretty stunning to me.
Well, if you want to drive matters in the direction of a great power competition, this is what you have to do, right? Yeah. You have to rebuke these lessons, because these lessons were there to make sure that we didn't have another great power competition in the world. And on the point about these institutions,
nobody was paying attention. The Supreme Court just absolutely obliterated and nuked black voting rights in this country. This is the biggest rollback of black voting rights in this country. In my lifetime. I mean, they are actually trying to roll the clock back to, pre-1960s type fucking red line, Jim Crow, segregation type stuff. They want to take away representation. They want taxation without representation when it comes to minority communities. This is insane what we're talking about here. So Democracy Doc says the following. Breaking. The Supreme Court just fast-tracked its ruling in Louisiana versus Calais, clearing the way for Louisiana to gerrymander its congressional map mid-election after previously warning courts not to change rules close to elections. In other words, this is the MAGA Supreme Court rushing in at the last second to chuck up a buzzer beater to try to help Republicans rig the midterms. That's what this is. And in the process of doing that, absolutely destroying the rights of Black Americans and minority Americans. So what happened in this case is Louisiana basically is making a second Democratic congressional district. They had one. They're making it two because the population has grown. And the Supreme Court looked at this and said, no, you're doing this. You're doing a racial gerrymander along racial lines. So we're wiping out that map and we're having the maps be redrawn to represent black voters less. It's the classic,
your attempt to make things equal, your attempt to stop the racists is actually racist. That's their argument. Is like, no, you have to let the Republican white racists do what they want and, take away the representation for black people, and that's how it's fair. This is like the argument, unironically, this is like the argument that they're making. Okay, more. Democracy Docket says, by the time Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry suspended ongoing elections to give lawmakers time to redraw the state's congressional map, roughly 42,000 Louisianans already cast their votes, and it's likely many voted in the House primaries. Now, their ballots are at risk of being thrown out. So 42,000 people cast ballots. And because of the Supreme Court here, it looks like those ballots are just going to be fucking tossed out, and they're like canceling an election and redoing an election on more favorable terms to the Republicans. For the life of me, I don't understand why more people aren't talking about this. This is insane. What we're talking about here is absolutely positively insane. So Jen Rice says, this is insane. Even if you are too tired to follow the news, you have to understand this. The Louisiana governor has suspended an active congressional election with 42,000 votes already cast. That is so fucking crazy, bro. That's so crazy. New, Trump's DOJ is preparing to weaponize the Supreme Court's gutting of the Voting Rights Act and challenge maps that protect black and Latino voters, starting with California. So, the Supreme Court opens up the door here and says, yeah, any districts that are drawn to protect black people's rights and give them a say and give them a vote and give them a voice, those are actually racist. Even though the whole point was like an attempt to make things more equal and fix racism, they go, no, those are actually racist. And so the Supreme Court opens up the door to basically smash up all those districts and hand all the power back to white Republicans, right? And then they do this. So the second the Supreme Court makes the decision, boom. Trump's Department of Justice is on top of it immediately. They basically were waiting for this decision, and they are going to fucking take a sledgehammer to black districts. The Supreme Court issued the Calais ruling this morning. By afternoon, a Republican senator had sent a letter to the DOJ demanding a nationwide review of minority-drawn districts. Within minutes, Harmeet Dillon, who runs the DOJ Civil Rights Division, replied...